Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for a discussion on the child marriage problem in the United States. I'm Michelle Hanash, Director of Policy and Advocacy at Unchained at Last, the only organization dedicated to ending forced and child marriage in the U.S. through direct services and advocacy. We also lead the now growing national movement to end child marriage in the U.S. I'd like to thank Kilpatrick Townsend and DLA Piper for sponsoring this event. I'd also like to give a shout out to our allies in our state and national coalitions to end child marriage who are watching. This year marks Unchained's 10-year anniversary, since Fraidy Reiss, our executive director and forced marriage survivor herself, founded the organization. What started as a group of volunteers in Fraidy's living room is now a national organization that has helped over 700 people escape forced marriage, or marriage in which one or both parties does not give full and free consent. And in 2015, because more and more girls were reaching out to us for help, we added our advocacy mission of ending child marriage in the US. Child marriage, or marriage before 18, is a recognized human rights abuse. And so our hashtag is 18 no exceptions, because one does not compromise on a human rights abuse. We would like to begin the program with a short 3-minute video written and produced by Unchained of a poem we had intended to perform flash mob style until COVID hit. So instead, we produced this film COVID style, with child marriage survivors performing the piece from their homes around the US.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light the girls you have destroyed?
You clawed out the broad stripes and bright stars. You shredded what should have been old glory.
On the remnants, you imprinted in blood marriage licenses of impunity.
License to turn a child into a bride. License to punish girls for pregnancy.
License to turn wedlock into steel locks, while the bald eagle circles closely.
Oh, hey, do you think as the dusk turns to night of the children you exploit? Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light the girls you have destroyed?
She's nearly 18. Nearly, you say. She's old enough to be handed over.
Betrayed by her own father or mother, a judge who sees one more docket number.
She's old enough to be a wife, you say, not old enough to escape her abuser, not old enough to go to a shelter.
Not old enough to hire a lawyer, file for divorce, or protective order.
Oh, hey, do you think as the dusk turns to night of the children you exploit? Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light the girls you have destroyed?
Every time she's raped, you are the rapist. With every beating, you are her aggressor.
When she is forced to become a mother, pulled out of school, and robbed of a future, you are the thief. You are the oppressor.
She has the right to remain silenced. She can count on you as the enforcer.
She dies inside. You are the murderer.
Oh, hey, do you think as the dusk turns to night of the children you exploit? Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light the girls you have destroyed?
We, the people, demand you take action. We demand you pass the legislation. No marriage before 18, no exception.
If you want to remain employed, we, the people, demand you change the law.
No more girls you will destroy.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light the girls you have destroyed?
I would now like to extend a warm welcome to one of the child marriage survivors you just saw in our video, Pat Abatemarco. Pat is a mental health advocate who first reached out to Unchained at Last almost 2 years ago to ask how she could get involved to prevent what happened to her from happening to any other child. Since then, she has chained in with us in Minnesota, and she wrote her story for us to read aloud to legislators to show them the real life impacts of child marriage. Welcome, Pat.
Good afternoon. My name is Pat Abatemarco. As a girl, I lived with my family in a middle-class suburb and attended an amazing public school. From the outside, my life probably looked a lot like yours, but my family life was filled with abuse and neglect. And at age 12, I tried to take my own life. Soon after taking the pills, I had second thoughts, and I called a teen helpline. And that's the moment when I met the third-year Bible student who would go on to become my husband. When I got out of the hospital, he encouraged my parents to throw the antidepressants away and said that all I really needed was counseling that he would provide for free. A few months later, he convinced my parents to let him move in with us. The molestation began almost immediately. Just before I was 14 years old, I found out I was pregnant. My parents offered me a choice. They said that I could give my baby up for adoption, or I could keep the baby, but only if I married him. They said that I brought shame onto the family, and at least I could do the right thing. So we took a road trip to Alabama, and in a 6-minute ceremony, I was married to the now 27-year-old sadistic sociopath, and my life was never going to be the same. When I was 7.5 months pregnant, I went to my school for a visit, and I was leaving. He was behind me, and I suddenly felt his hand at the small of my back as he shoved me down the concrete and metal steps. It was the first time he'd been violent, but it wouldn't be the last. I tried to juggle 9th grade, keeping my house, taking care of my daughter, and trying to keep us both alive as he grew more violent every day. I fled barefoot in the middle of a Minnesota winter. My parents allowed me to stay overnight, but the next morning, after talking to my husband, my father said, "You're a married woman now, and you have to deal with your own problems." I told him that he was going to kill us. It didn't matter. We were sent back. I finally got a social worker to listen, and she came, and I was dragged away screaming, and my child was left behind. I was placed in a shelter for battered children. Eventually, I found a lawyer to take my divorce case pro bono. I left school one day and with my parents drove to family court. I got a divorce. I made sure that his parental rights had been terminated. And I broke my own heart by making sure that my child would grow up without knowing anyone in my family. I still made it back to school in time for 11th grade English class. I went on to become a raging alcoholic. I tried to kill myself by drinking from 18 to 21. I finally got sober in November of 1987. I rebuilt my own life. I rebuilt myself a family. I tried to never look back, but the problem is that I have chronic PTSD and certain symptoms just don't ever go away. These girls in coerced and forced marriages are stuck. Who looks out for them? My coerced marriage helped my parents to keep their social standing and kept my husband from being charged with rape. I was one of the lucky ones. I got out. We have to fight to pass legislation to prevent this from happening to more girls. Thank you.
Pat, as always, I am just in awe of your courage and your strength. Thank you for sharing your painful story. I am Fraidy Reiss. I'm a forced marriage survivor, and I'm the founder and executive director of Unchained At Last. And I'd like to start with a quick poll to test your knowledge of child marriage in the United States. I'm curious how many of you know what is the youngest marriage age allowed right now in any U.S. state? Is it 18? Is it 16? Is it 14? Or is it 0? Submit your answers now, and let's see what you had to say. All right, so it looks like 63% of you knew the correct answer is 0. There are still 9 US states, as varied as California and West Virginia, that do not specify any minimum age for marriage. But there are 45 US states where child marriage remains legal at various ages. So let's talk about the United States child marriage problem. For a long time, no one really knew how often child marriage was happening here, but our new study, which was the first of its kind, answered that question. With funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in partnership with McGill University, 2 investigative firms, QRI and Kroll, and a statistician from Quantitative Analysis, we calculated the full extent of the child marriage problem here. Our findings were shocking, and you can read them all at unchainedAtLast.org. We found that nearly 300,000 children were married in the United States between 2000 and 2018. A few of them were as young as 10. Most of them were girls married to adult men with an average age difference of 4 years. And further shocking was some 60,000 marriages occurred at an age or with a spousal age difference that should have been considered a sex crime. There was one positive note. The national number of children wed decreased almost every year between 2000 and 2018, but it will not get to 0 without legislative intervention. Because here's a key takeaway from our study. The 300,000 children were all married legally. For most of 2000 to 2018, child marriage was legal in all 50 US states. And as of today, as I mentioned, it remains legal in 45 states. And the federal government is at fault too. There are laws, federal laws in place that allow and even encourage child marriage, as we point out in the study. There are 3 main reasons that we are so concerned about child marriage and need it to end immediately, even for highly mature 16 or 17-year-olds. First, it can too easily be forced. And that's because minors have limited legal rights until the day they turn 18. Typically, they're not even allowed to leave home to escape from parents who are planning an unwanted wedding for them or to escape from an abusive spouse. Typically, they cannot get into a domestic violence shelter before they turn 18. They cannot easily retain an attorney to help them figure out all of this because contracts with children typically are avoidable. And then perhaps most upsetting, children typically are not allowed to bring a legal action in their own name, which means in many states, they're not even allowed to file for divorce. So marriage for a minor creates a nightmarish legal trap. Second important reason to end child marriage, the US State Department calls marriage before 18 a human rights abuse. It destroys almost every aspect of an American girl or woman's life, her health, her education, her economic opportunities, even her safety. It makes her much more likely to be physically assaulted by her spouse. And then the third reason was, as I mentioned before, it undermines our statutory rape laws. Tens of thousands of children were married here recently before they were even old enough to consent to sex. But there is a very simple solution. 45 states need to do what 5 states have done so far, set the marriage age as 18, no exceptions. And the federal government needs to update its laws as well to change the ones that right now allow child marriage. There are some social injustices that have no simple solution. Child marriage is not one of them. We can end child marriage in the United States in our lifetime. And in fact, we can end it this year if we all join together and insist that our legislators take action. And now I am honored to introduce Dr. Yvette Efevbera. She's an advisor at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and she's the one who made this study possible when she reached out to Unchained one lucky day to talk about the possibility of funding new child marriage research. Yvette?
Thank you, Fraidy. That's far too generous an introduction. Thank you for opening this, and to Patricia, to Pat, for your candid experience. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you all for being here. Again, my name is Dr. Yvette Efevbera, and as the Gates Foundation lead on child marriage and gender-based violence, I'm honored to share a few remarks here on why the study matters as part of a global effort. Worldwide, 650 million girls and women alive today married before their 18th birthdays, with consequences for them, their children, and their communities. And despite global commitments, no region is on track towards eliminating this practice by 2030. To accelerate progress last year at the Gates Foundation, we started piloting working with organizations to advance child marriage data and evidence, build connection with advocacy, and create space for connection with one another. Through leading this study, Unchained at Last has been such an important collaborator, bringing 3 new insights I'll briefly share. Number 1, too often global conversations around child marriage exclude the U.S., which, as this study shows, we're reminded of how much this practice continues here. Number 2, empirical data matters towards understanding how big the problem itself is. And number 3, we can raise and shape new voices to lead rigorous research, including advocates, grassroots partners, and survivor-led efforts as Unchained represents. I celebrate that Unchained at Last has given the world these insights that Fraidy just shared, but I lament that these results are what they are, that 300,000 young people who were previously not counted have married before their 18th birthday. At the Gates Foundation, and personally as an advocate, I am looking forward to continuing to be in partnership on how to build solutions using this type of research for and with survivors and young people to advance a global movement. Thank you for your time, for this work, and to all of you for your commitment.
Thank you, Yvette. Our child marriage problem requires a solution at both the state and federal level. We now turn it over to U.S. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois for remarks.
I first want to thank you, Unchained at Last, for being a pioneer in the fight to end child marriage through its tireless advocacy to raise awareness on this issue. Child marriage is a serious problem even here in the United States. According to the most recent study by Unchained at Last, nearly 300,000 minors were married in the United States between 2000 and 2018. Most of them were girls, and most of them married older adult men. The State Department has deemed child marriage a human rights abuse. Far too often, victims of child marriage face a curtailed education, economic hardship, physical and mental health issues, early pregnancy, and domestic violence. Because they're minors, victims of child marriage can struggle to get help from domestic violence shelters, retain a lawyer, file a protective order, file for divorce, or even consent to medical treatment they desperately need. Despite these significant challenges, child marriages remain legal in 45 states. 45 states. Years ago, I introduced the International Protecting Girls by Preventing Child Marriage Act with former Maine Senator Olympia Snowe. Our bill called for an integrated, strategic approach to combating child marriage and eventually ending the practice worldwide. It was enacted into law as part of the 2013 Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. Now it's time to do more to combat child marriage at the federal level. As chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I hope to work with my colleagues in Congress on a bipartisan basis to encourage more states to ban child marriage and to close problematic loopholes in federal law. It's time to end child marriage, here in the United States and across the world. Thank you again to Unchained at Last for being a leader in this fight, and to everyone joining this conversation today.
Thank you, Senator Durbin, for your strong leadership at the federal level. We also need strong leadership at the state level to solve this problem. Here to discuss state efforts to end child marriage are 2 of the many state legislators leading their state towards ending child marriage. New York State Senator Julia Salazar, who in 2018 was the youngest woman elected in the history of the New York State Senate, and South Carolina State Senator Katrina Shealy, who is the first Republican woman to serve as chair of a standing committee in the South Carolina Senate. Here to moderate the discussion, we are so grateful to have Chelsea Clinton with us today. Chelsea is the chair is the vice chair of the Clinton Foundation and a longtime friend of Unchained at Last, an ally in our fight to end child marriage in the U.S.
Thank you so much, really, for that just generous introduction. It is so wonderful to see so many familiar faces. Fraidy, it's always just such an honor to be anywhere with you in this work, even in virtual space. But I know that we are in such kind of deep, authentic community and solidarity. And I want to thank everyone from the Gates Foundation, from the United Nations, and everyone I know who worked so hard to bring us together today. And while I have some specific questions to ask, I really want to ask our two state legislators, who I am incredibly honored that you took time out of your busy schedules on a weekday to be with us to talk about this urgent issue. What really brought you both to this work? And I think I'll start with Julia Salazar, because although she's not my representative, we're not that far from each other in New York. So Ms. Salazar, could you just please explain how you came to this work, why it is so important, and then Ms. Shealy, will turn to you.
Absolutely. Can everyone hear me? I think you can. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Chelsea. And I also just want to mention, Patricia, thank you for having the courage to share your story. You are just remarkably resilient, as is everyone who survives child marriage as it persists in the United States. I have the honor of getting to chair the Women's Issues Committee in the New York State Senate. And it was actually Assemblyman Phil Ramos who approached me a couple of years ago. I think it was in 2019, when he approached me and introduced me to survivors of child marriage, and told me about the legislation and the existing law in the state of New York. And because in my position as chair of the committee in particular, I was really motivated to do something about it and respond to the call to finally end child marriage without any exceptions in the state of New York, because of course, it does not exclusively impact girls and young women, but it certainly disproportionately impacts girls and young women. And so I felt a responsibility, given my position on the committee, and also as a young woman myself, to take action on behalf of other women. So I'm really grateful for the work that Unchained at Last has done, the years of work and advocacy in order to get us to this point.
That's the only challenge of, like, when I'm trying to ensure there's no background noise, is I forget that I have silenced myself. And Ms. Shealy, State Senator Shealy, how did you come to this work of trying to end child marriage?
One of the things that I'm most passionate about, and I am chairman of Family and Veteran Services, but one of the things I'm most passionate about in the state of South Carolina is children's issues. And we are talking about children. And when you talk about child marriage, it's such a big issue. And, in South Carolina, it's been a big issue. And we have a problem getting people to understand, what the outcome will be, what the consequences are of child marriage. And I think that that's what brought me to this point. And I was actually approached by the BBC when they were doing, their big expose on child marriage in the United States. And that brought me more to my attention about what was going on. Although we knew there was a problem, they did the big event on that and came all over the United States, and it brought it more to our attention. So I think that, and the fact that I am very passionate about children, regardless of the issue. So that got me more involved.
Well, and just sitting here with both of you, this shouldn't be a partisan issue, right? Protecting children should not be a partisan issue, and it shouldn't be hard. And yet, I have been, really privileged to support Fraidy and Unchained at Last in this work now for many, many years, and it often has been quite hard to get the attention of state legislatures, Democrats and Republicans. It's been quite hard to kind of build consensus around what I think should be a rather simple premise that children should be able to be children. And so, Julia, like turning to you, this has not been easy in New York. And I know you were talking about kind of the work that you kind of came into, but now that you really are helping to lead, I mean, we've had 4 attempts, I think, to have no exception, kind of child marriage. We've made so much progress here in New York. What do you think other states can learn from our work? What more do you think still has to happen here?
That's a great question. I mean, at least immediately, we do need the governor to sign the bill into law, although I'm very hopeful that he will. I think that it's important to note, as you did, that I think of this more as a threshold was finally reached and broken through in New York, that the advocacy of Unchained at Last, the advocacy of people who've been impacted by child marriage in New York State had been building toward this for years. And so it was not, as you know, that it happened overnight. It's a shame that it did take this long to get to this point. Then the most recent development in New York State, before we finally passed the legislation through both houses to end child marriage without exceptions, was I guess it was a few years ago at this point, maybe a little bit longer than a few years ago, when New York made it so that a 17-year-old could get a marriage license, could get married with parental consent, which of course we all know is not sufficient and does not actually end child marriage. But I know that others in the legislature saw that as a step toward fully ending child marriage without exceptions in New York State. I think that in other states, we should be insisting from the outset, just as Unchained at Last is, that the only way to truly end child marriage is to end child marriage without exceptions. It still is allowing for abuse and harm when we allow for any exceptions, such as the existing law in New York until our legislation is signed. So I think just keeping that in mind and not being willing to compromise when there is enormous pressure in legislating to compromise on our issues and to say that it's better than nothing. We need to always be fighting for the full thing, for the real achievement of ending child marriage.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I framed the question the way that I did because I think there thankfully has been so much attention to the legislation, and yet we know that is not, the finish line. The finish line is when the governor signs the legislation. And so, for any fellow New Yorkers who are here, I hope that you will join us in continuing to put positive pressure on our governor to do the right thing. And Senator Shealy, I know that you also have really been trying to end child marriage in South Carolina, and thankfully also are not giving up. But maybe you could just share some reflections on the work thus far and what you think needs to happen to try to actually successfully achieve, a ban with no exceptions to protect kids in South Carolina.
Well, last year, we passed the pregnancy, where we got the pregnancy ban, where you couldn't get married, you couldn't make somebody get married just because they were pregnant, because in South Carolina, that's the big issue we have. They think if you're pregnant, parents think you've got to get married, save the family name, those issues. But we got that over the finish line last year, and we had the other legislation out there, the 18 with no exceptions, but it didn't go anywhere. And this year we have that legislation out there, and Senator Hutto and I, Senator Hutto is a Democrat, I'm a Republican, so we're making it a bipartisan issue. So you can't fight that issue on the floor. And we finally got that out of judiciary and got it on the floor. And we actually did get it read across the floor. But time we got it read across the floor, of course, we had 2 objections that day. And so it was stuck, right there sitting on the Senate floor. But I think in 2022, we've already started doing some talking with the legislators that, have an issue with it. And it is always the same issue. here in South Carolina. But I think we're not going to stop fighting. You know, Senator Hutto and I are both strong advocates for children. We both serve on the Legislative Council for Children, and we're both going to, you know, keep fighting it and make sure it gets passed. You know, everything in South Carolina is sometimes slow, but we're not going to give up. And, you know, legislation doesn't always get passed as quick as you want. And sometimes it's taken that half loaf, you know, like we had to do last year, because we at least got part of what we were looking for. It's not what we want, but sometimes you'd have to take it step by step. But next year we're going to, you know, bring it back up, you know, time we get in January and continue fighting. But it is on the Senate calendar. And, you know, we have a better opportunity to get it out of the Senate. I worry about what will happen when it gets to the House, because sometimes, you know, there's a lot more of them over there, and, you know, we can't always get things done as easily in the House, but we're going to continue to work on it.
Well, I am just, you know, so curious, you know, to really hear from both of you. And again, you know, I'll start with you, Senator Salazar. Like, what are the most common points of pushback? Is it, oh, well, this just isn't that big an issue because it doesn't affect that many kids? Is it sort of this just like disrespect towards kids and kids' rights? Is it kind of what, you know, Senator Shealy was saying of like, oh, well, you know, we have to preserve the family name, or you don't understand our culture, or like what? I'm just curious, like, what do you hear are the main points of defense for something that I think is so fundamentally, admittedly, indefensible? And then what have you found to be successful strategies to, you know, help persuade people that, you know, this isn't a threat to your culture, this isn't a threat to kind of what your norms are, this is actually, you know, more about avoiding a threat to kids?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think that I certainly am familiar with what Senator Shealy spoke about in terms of the opposition, but I think the most common pushback that I've heard in advocating for this in New York State is the argument that child marriage is a cultural practice, and that therefore, you know, of course, I'm not sympathetic to this argument, but therefore it is culturally insensitive to make sure that child marriage will no longer be lawful. And, you know, I won't evaluate whether or not child marriage is uniquely a part of any certain cultures, but my stance and my response to that is that child marriage is child abuse and exploitation, and we wouldn't tolerate that. It's just not justified by the idea that it is a cultural practice. There are so many things that we would not tolerate that we would consider to be a human rights abuse, and cultural sensitivity really has nothing to do with it, and it doesn't justify practices like this. I think additionally, the most compelling, the most powerful, I guess, tool that we all have an argument is for legislators to hear directly from people who have experienced this, who have survived child marriage, or who have been directly impacted by this practice. Their stories, your stories, are incredibly powerful. And I think it goes a long way. Legislators can't look at someone and say, your story and your experience is not valid, or this doesn't actually happen in New York State. That's really what is so powerful about the personal stories that survivors are courageous enough to share.
And Senator Shealy, from your perspective?
I agree with Senator Salazar that it is a cultural thing, you know, especially, you know, Chelsea, you're from the South. You know that, you know, in the South, if you get pregnant, you should get married. You know, that's what we were always taught. That, and a lot, you know, it's changed over the years, but it's what that, you know, growing up, we were taught that if you get pregnant, you should get married, and parents they push that. You know, times have changed, but that's our biggest pushback here in the South. But, you know, what we need to push is that the data just shows that teens that marry, they become mothers then, and then eventually they're going to have more children, one right after another. They don't get their education. They don't go back to school. Even the father, if he's young, he's not going to go back to school. They're not going to get an education. They're going to grow up in poverty. They're going to be abused, neglected. They're going to end up, having domestic violence issues. So, that's what we have to explain to the people. We have to tell them, you say this, but this is what's going to happen to your child. If you push them into getting married, this is what's going to happen. And I think if we can explain that to them, because the people that I'm pushing back against, the people in the Senate chamber that are pushing back because of, well, what if my child would get pregnant? I want them to get married. I don't want to, that stigma on my family. Well, I would rather have that stigma on my family than have the fact that my child got married, she was in an abusive relationship, there was a divorce, or something happened to my grandchildren. So I just think that we have to show it both sides of it, and I think it'll be a better outcome.
Well, I know that we are very close to time, but I do just want to give both of you the chance. And I think Senator Salazar, I know what you're going to say because I'm a fellow New Yorker now, although I am very proud to be originally from Arkansas, Senator Shealy. For anyone who's joining us from New York or from South Carolina, what can they do? Just really specifically as you're talking to your constituents and kind of your constituents' neighbors and other districts. Senator Salazar was like, what can they do to try to help put pressure on the governor?
Yeah, and I'm also really curious to hear from Senator Shealy on this, given the bill having a different status in your state. But I would say, talk to the governor directly, publicly, say this issue is important to me. It's important that we truly finally end child marriage. It's an opportunity for our governor to lead on this and to be at the forefront of this movement that is really a national movement, right? It's an opportunity and not, a liability for him or for us in New York, that this is an opportunity to lead, and calling the governor's office, sending emails, any way that you're able to get the attention of the governor's administration and his staff. But I am very hopeful that he'll sign the legislation.
And Senator Shealy, just really want to give you the last word for anyone who might be listening.
Chelsea, I just want you to know that I was trying to claim you as a Southern girl. Okay, so that was not an insult. I was just trying to claim you.
I didn't take it. I was doing something earlier today with the United Methodist Foundation of Arkansas.
Okay,
so
I was just trying to claim you as our own. But I think the thing that's important, we need to make people and our legislators, because, I got to get it to the governor, but we need to make the citizens and our legislators aware, because I think our legislators are scared to have the constituents are going to react. So the people that have been affected by this situation need to let people know how it has affected their lives. Just like Pat spoke earlier, and the videos, those need to come out so people can see this has affected my life. So I don't think people realize how much it affects children's lives. I think if they see that will make a difference, because people don't think that these children are really affected by this. And it really does make a difference. If we can make them aware, and that it's not going to affect whether you get reelected or not. It might affect you if you don't do something about it.
Well, amen. Well, Senator Shealy, Senator Salazar, thank you so much for your time. I'm incredibly grateful for both of your time today, and even more for what you're doing to help end child marriage. So thank you. Thank you both. And I want to briefly kind of give the proverbial floor back to Unchained.
Yeah, well, thank you. I echo what Chelsea said. Thank you, both Senator Shealy and Senator Salazar, for your leadership on this. Governor Cuomo, sign the bill, please. Before we continue, I just want to do another quick poll to test your knowledge of child marriage in the U.S. And I'm curious how many of you know which was the first U.S. state to end child marriage, which unfortunately has happened only as recently as 2018. Do you think it was Massachusetts, Delaware, Michigan, or Kansas? And let's see what you had to say. Okay, it looks like we have an educated audience here. 61% of you got it right. The answer is Delaware, but there is legislation pending in those other 3 states. as well as in multiple other states across the United States. So I urge you to go to unchainedatLast.org to see how you can help pass legislation in your state and all the other states. And so you can read the results of Unchained's new study of the extent of child marriage in the U.S. And Chelsea, I'm curious, what surprised you most about Unchained's new study?
Oh, well, Fraidy, I think unfortunately I wasn't particularly surprised because I've followed your work and your advocacy for so long. And I do, just really want to be explicit about how much we owe to you and really to the organization. Because while, you were kind of putting up the flash poll of kind of the first state to ban child marriage in 2018, Delaware, that you were saying, oh, well, unfortunately, it was just a few years ago. And I certainly feel that burden too. It was just a few years ago, but we know that that wouldn't have happened without your tireless work. And in no way to take away from everyone that we've had of Senator Shealy and Senator Salazar, Senator Durbin at the federal level, because we know that we have to operate on both a state and a federal level simultaneously. It just really, we owe a tremendous amount to you and your team. And so while not a lot surprised me, because I have really come to know the data kind of through your previous work, I do think it's so hugely important that we really continue to kind of put numbers on this crisis, as well as, of course, to center survivors, as you have done here with this event, and as Senator Salazar and Senator Shealy both said was so important to their work in New York and South Carolina, respectively. So unfortunately, not much surprised me, because I know that we have a crisis, and it just is only more painful that we haven't done more quickly to help protect more kids, and especially girls.
Yeah, I hear you. And by the way, I just want to say to you, I just can't thank you enough for your partnership in this. I'm pretty sure when you first got involved, child marriage was legal in all 50 US states. So that's
very much it was. Yes, very much it was.
And in each of those states, getting that bill passed, I always like to say it's like giving birth. It's just that much of a process. So if you just thank you for your leadership on that and joining us to make this happen. We need to end this human rights abuse.
We do. And I think that when we have to be candid about the extent of the abuse and the suffering here in the United States. I think so often, Fraidy, you and I have talked about this over many years, so often child marriage has been erroneously contextualized as something that happens to other kids in other places. But we know that it is something, it is a horrific set of some things that happen to kids here in the United States as well.
Exactly. And, so that's what, for me, like you, I wasn't very shocked by the number and the fact that there were 10-year-olds married, because like you, we've been steeply, working in this, so strongly for so many years that wasn't a total shock. But to me, the statutory rape piece was shocking, because we had never quantified that part before. And to discover that there were 60,000 marriages that occurred at an age or with a spousal age difference that should have been considered a sex crime, that's the kind of stuff that does keep you awake at night. And the breakdown of that, in about 88% of those cases, state law specifically allowed within marriage what otherwise would have been considered rape, which means that by issuing those marriage licenses, the state basically gave a get out of jail free card to a would-be child rapist.
They were whitewashing, right? They were laundering.
Yes.
Child
legalizing.
They were legalizing it.
Legalizing rape. And then in the other 12% of cases, this is also just mind-boggling. In the other 12%, the marriage was legal, but sex within that marriage remained a crime under state law. And think about what's happening then. Every time the state issues a marriage license like that, the state is literally sending a child home to be raped.
Well, I mean, Fraidy, like the separating out, well, that's impossible, but acknowledging kind of the context of abuse and violation, though in no way, I think, makes it less absurd or obscene how many kind of complete hypocrisies there are in so many of the states' kind of laws and regulations around child marriage and underage sex, and that those things do not often cohere, and yet kind of that incoherence doesn't save kids, which is why we so urgently need a no exceptions ban on child marriage, and then to have that kind of be manifest and kind of in any adjacent legislation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not only the statutory rape laws that the marriage age laws are contradicting, it's all these other laws where you're not allowed to enter into any other contract. You can't bring a legal action. I mean, we're just...
You can get married, but not divorced.
Exactly. And even to getting married, you can't do that on your own. Typically, for a child to marry, it's their parent and or a judge who enters them into the marriage. The children are completely disempowered in many cases throughout that process, entered into a marriage they're not allowed to legally get out of.
Right. So they don't consent to the marriage and they can't consent to the divorce.
Exactly. And yet somehow when we bring this to legislators in state after state, other than in the 5 states that have done this so far, and in New York where the legislature has passed the bill, and what we're getting from legislators in state after state is, why does that matter?
Yeah, and Fraidy, you and I have talked about this for a long time, and I think it's a kind of terrible coalescing of a dismissiveness of kids in general and a discounting of kids and children's rights, kind of just old-fashioned misogyny, because we know that while these issues are not exclusive to girls and young women, they disproportionately affect girls and young women. A general discomfort with anything that relates to sex, even if we're talking about actually protecting kind of children's rights and dignities and their health, because we know that child marriage often has quite disastrous consequences for girls' health. And so I think it's kind of all of those discomforts which somehow then often lead to people then not wanting to think about them or talk about them, instead of actually examining why they're uncomfortable and then wanting to actually do something about the sources of those discomforts. In this instance, like the horrific abuse of kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's this discomfort and also this feeling that a lot of legislators still have, that this is what Senator Shealy was saying, that a pregnant girl just has to get married. They want to keep loopholes in place so that they can marry off pregnant girls. And here's the thing. Policymakers used to believe that a pregnant teenage girl was better off getting married, that she and the baby were better off. And actually what studies show is that a pregnant teenage girl in the United States who marries is more likely to suffer economic deprivation and instability than a pregnant teenage girl who stays single. So we're not doing these girls any favors, or we're doing these states any favors by marrying off these girls.
And that's what Senator Shealy alluded to. I mean, that clearly is part of the argument that she's trying to make to her fellow legislators and kind of, the people who sent her to office, like the people who voted for her and the people she represents who didn't vote for her, as to why it's so important in kind of her mandate as a state legislator to try to, ban child marriage without exceptions. But Fraidy, one of the things I also, though, am continually bewildered is maybe not the right kind of description, but am puzzled by is the real kind of inconsistency between so many legislators, especially at the federal level, who talk about the child marriage crisis outside the United States and talk about children's rights outside the United States and talk about girls and women's rights outside the United States, and yet don't have that same kind of focus or fervency for trying to focus on women and children's rights, and specifically kind of the imperative of banning child marriage here in the United States. Why do you think that is inconsistent? And maybe you could help or just explain why, as much as we often talk about this as a state by state issue, it is also a federal issue. And so kind of the senators who are and the Congress people who are trying to help, eliminate child marriage abroad also should be attentive to this at home.
Well, that's a really good question. I can't answer why. All I know is it is maddening when you see the incredible contradiction between our domestic policy and our foreign policy when it comes to child marriage. So when we establish our foreign policy, the U.S. State Department has called marriage before 18 a human rights abuse. The federal government allocates more than $10 million a year toward ending child marriage in every other country. And yet here in the United States, marriage age is set at the state level, and 45 US states still allow it. And then at the federal level, we see laws that not only allow, but actually encourage child marriage. So to give you a couple of examples, our immigration law, there is no minimum age to petition for a foreign spouse or fiance or to be the beneficiary of a spousal or fiance visa. And what that does is that encourages the trafficking of children for their citizenship. We've seen girls forcefully married to adult men overseas so that these men can get their visa and a path to citizenship, and girls trafficked to the United States from another country, legally trafficked under the guise of marriage. There's also, we have a federal criminal code that criminalizes sex with a child aged 12 to 15, unless you first marry the child. Our federal criminal code says if you marry the child, you won't be charged with rape. So we're encouraging not only child marriage, but child rape. So this is just shocking. Under the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, 193 countries, including the United States, we have all promised that we are going to end child marriage by year 2030. That's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 5.3. That we entered in 2015. We made our promise to the world that we're going to end child marriage by year 2030. We are now halfway through 2021. And so far, only 5 US states have taken action.
You know, Fraidy, I know we don't talk as much about kind of the health consequences beyond the kind of obvious human rights abuses and health danger of child rape, kind of especially when ostensibly sanctified kind of by the bonds of marriage. But we also know that it's not only kind of child rape that's a health consequence for children, especially girls who are forced into marriage. We know that a girl who gives birth before the age of 15 is 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than someone who's in their 20s. So while kind of it may not seem like a big difference of kind of 15 to 20, it's actually a huge difference in terms of not only your maturity, but also your health, your wellness, and at least in this country, in most states, actually your rights. And so I'm just curious, Fraidy, to ask you a question similar to what I asked Senator Salazar and Shealy, which is, how do you try to persuade people who are dismissive that this is an issue, that it actually is an issue, that this isn't something that they can just ignore because it doesn't matter, because the people who are affected matter. And then once they have recognized it's an issue, kind of that there's really only one answer, which is to ban marriage without exceptions. How do you help people focus on it as an issue, kind of name it as an issue, feel responsibility to that issue, and then recognize that this is not one of those instances when there are like many potential right answers. It's actually just one.
Well, the way we do it at Unchained At Last and our allies as well is we don't focus on any kind of maturity arguments, because is there really a significant difference between the maturity level of a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old? Not really. What this is about legal capacity. Until the day you turn 18, you do not have the rights of adulthood, or you do not have the rights that you need to navigate a contract as serious as marriage. If you don't have the right to get divorced, to leave home, to get into a domestic violence shelter, to retain an attorney, then you should not also have the right to marry, because that's not a right at that point. That is a trap. So we focus on that as it's a legal, logical argument, because that's really what this all comes down to. The fact that it's a human rights abuse, the fact that it undermines the statutory rape laws, all the other reasons to end child marriage are almost secondary to that, because how can you argue in favor of anyone, child or adult, being allowed to enter into a contract they can't get out of?
And Fraidy, I know we're out of time, but I do have to ask you a question because I imagine there are a lot of people here who are thinking it. Which is that, before you and Unchained at Last entered into this work, child marriage was legal in every state. It is now illegal in 5 states, hopefully soon to be 6. I'm speaking here as a New Yorker. Yes, but all fingers and toes crossed. And yet, the majority of kids in our country still live in states where it is legal. And I know that you're not giving up until child marriage is banned everywhere, and no child will be forced into marriage. But is it ever kind of discouraging work? Do you ever feel like, oh my God, how do I just keep going? Because the challenge is so enormous and the amount of work is so enormous. And the cynicism, unfortunately, is often so enormous. And sometimes the progress is steady but slow. Like, how do you keep going, and how do you kind of give advice to anyone who might be listening to us today to just think, oh, this is too much, I couldn't do this, to say you can keep going too? So how do you do it, and what advice do you have for people who may be listening to us today?
Well, thank you for that question. That's a tough one. There are so many times that we just want to yell. We actually have this spreadsheet that we use internally to track the legislation in different states and what has passed. We call it the BIHAWS. It stands for the Bang Your Head Against the Wall spreadsheet, because this is so maddening to talk to legislators and explain to them the facts and then have them say, like one legislator said to me, what's so bad about a girl marrying her rapist? I mean, it's just infuriating. And what keeps us going is survivors like Pat, who share their stories and remind us how crucial this work is, or girls who are not yet 18 who reach out to us terrified, begging for help. And we have to tell them, I'm so sorry. We cannot help you now because the legislation in your state has not yet passed. We're working on it. I mean, how can we turn our backs on those girls? So that is what keeps us going. And thank you so much, Chelsea, for standing with us as we fight this fight. As you said, we're not giving up. 18 no exceptions across the U.S. and at the federal level.
We're not giving up. We're going to get it done here in New York State, and then we're just going to keep going. Fraidy, thank you so much. It's just always such an honor to be with you in any and every way.
Thank you.
People often have a strong reaction when they learn that child marriage is so prevalent throughout the United States, and that legislators have not yet taken the simple steps needed to end all child marriage throughout the U.S. Here with the reaction is Blair Imani. Blair is a critically acclaimed historian, author, educator, and influencer whose work centers around women and girls, global Black communities, and the LGBTQ community. Blair is dedicated to making the world a better place and amplifying the voice and work of those fighting the good fight.
Hello, thank you all so much for having me. Thank you so much to our elected officials who joined us, to Chelsea Clinton, to Fraidy, for this necessary conversation. When I first learned about the child marriage issue in the United States, I remember vaguely learning that maybe it was legal in a few states, but to know that it's legal in 45 states, 46 just a few weeks ago, until Rhode Island decided to take action, which we commend, and want other states to emulate, I was feeling so immobilized with fear, with panic. And I think that that's something that can happen to us. We can feel very much like, what can we do? But we can honestly do so much. I truly believe, and the studies show, that the primary issue here is lack of awareness and this propensity that Chelsea mentioned, which is thinking that it's a faraway problem that needs a faraway solution. But it's happening right here in our backyard, right here in the United States, the land of the free, where we are trapping children into abuse. And so what do we do about it? We can write to our elected officials. We can sign up for Unchained's actions, following Unchained at Last on social media, just staying aware. They've embraced me so warmly into this movement, into this fight. And it just shows you that there is space for everyone in this movement to end legalized child abuse, to end these human rights violations. We have the stats, we have the facts, it's happening. It's not something that's between childhood sweethearts coming together at equal levels. It's allowing child abuse to proliferate through legalized mechanisms. And it has to end, and it can end. There is momentum, we can take action. Just call your elected officials, write emails. There's formats and templates, there's stats, there's facts all over Unchained at Last page. There's a coalition, that an organization that I serve on the board of, Muslims for Progressive Values, is a part of. And we have to remember that this is an intersectional issue. As much as there are conversations about wanting to protect kids from the fears and scary things in the world, the fact is that this is going on unattended. And I thank Unchained at Last for taking the charge, for the fearless work of Fraidy Reiss to take action for our young people to make sure that this never happens again. So I hope that you'll join me in getting extremely passionate about this fight and pouring your whole body into this work, because your momentum, your passion, your drive, your participation is needed. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Blair. Legislation to end child marriage harms no one, costs nothing, and ends a human rights abuse. Please visit unchainedatLast.org to see how you can help end child marriage in the U.S., including by donating to Unchained at Last, joining one of our state or national coalitions to end child marriage, and learning other ways you can get involved, like building awareness by following us on social media and sharing and liking our posts and tweets. Thank you for joining us today. And remember, 18, no exceptions.